This week my music teacher died and in his will asked me to finish a piece of music he was writing. What was the coolest last request you've gotten? My great aunt left me a huge lot of costume jewelry that had belonged to her and my great grandma. Most of it either strands of broken fake pearls and beads, or pendants whose necklaces were long since lost. I was a teenager at the time. She included a note that read to Snowleaf, my favorite little artist, "I know you can make these shine." So, I took the pearls and the fake beads and the pendants and ripped them all off their strings, and made and remixed the bits into some modern looking, nice jewelry pieces with working clasps. I kept a few of my new designs but I gifted most of them to my mom and my aunts, who loved them and wear them all the time. Now, the beads and pearls are on different strings and are now mismatched from their original settings, but I tried to remake them into fitting pieces for each woman in my family, and now they are all still worn to this day, even though the jewelry's net worth was maybe $50. My great aunt knew I liked to rip up old jewelry and repurpose it, and I think she'd be happy to know that her beads and pearls and pendants are still being worn by her family today, mixed together with her mother's junk jewelry. 2. Made me feel useful. She was the most wonderful woman ever. Do you mind posting some pictures of the jewelry? I like your story and I'm curious. My grandfather wrote letters each year from the time he was 24 until his death at 78. They were all descriptions of his year and advice, intended for the son he would never have. In his will he specified they would go to me, his oldest grandson, every year on my birthday that corresponds with the letter year. I received that year's letter. It has provided some of the best advice I have ever received, and a great way to remember him. I have started writing my own for my future son. I used to play piano all the time when my dad was dying of a brain tumor my senior year of high school. He asked me to play piano at his funeral. I still don't know how I did it. I couldn't see the keys with the tears welling in my eyes. I was so honored. I am yet to comprehend how people do anything at the funerals of one of their parents. Eulogies are especially perplexing to me. My grandfather asked me to carry on his little library of old books, mostly war books since he is a World War II vet, when he dies. I've read a couple, and let me tell you, some of those books are rare. I reckon that some are hundreds of dollars alone. He put a lot of time into that collection of books, and I'm dang proud that he chose me, not my older brother, to look after them and continue the collection when he passes. I was part of this event, called The Longest Walk. I started in Portland and went the entire way to Washington, D.C. I had always wanted my grandfather to be proud of me and to take an interest in me. This was a Native American event, and that is one of the only things we had in common. We never got to know each other as much as we wanted. I talked to my grandfather when I was about 3 months in. We were in North Dakota. My grandfather told me he was very proud of me and wanted me to finish it all the way. He was getting quite ill at the time. I didn't know the extent of it though. When I got to Illinois a month later, he passed away in his sleep. I was going to take the first Greyhound, clean, whatever, out back to my home to make it to the funeral. He was a very active member of the Native and veteran community in the area. I wanted to send my regards and see all who had known him. My parents told me I shouldn't. When they last talked to him, he said again how proud he was of his granddaughter, and how happy it would have made him to make it the entire way. From what his wife told me, my step-grandmother, he wanted me to go the entire way, and to only make it to his memorial. That is coming up next month. He died almost a year ago. TLDR. Native American grandfather wanted me to walk across the United States, even to skip his funeral. Of all the stories I've read on here today, this one touched me the most. Thank you for sharing. My grandmother did something similar. She was in the hospice and they had a piano in the lobby. My dad and I wheeled it into her room and I played for her a song that I was composing. It wasn't finished, so after I reached the last notes, she said, "Promise me you'll finish it when you get home. I want to hear it when you come back." She died a few days later and I never got to go back. I still don't have the song done. Nothing that I write seems good enough. You finish that song. Led up to. Pour your heart into that song. And finish it. I know you can. My friend specified in his will that if he were to die before his dog, He wanted me to give the dog a bar mitzvah. Additionally, he left me $50,000 from his company's life insurance policy in order to throw his dog the best bar mitzvah our town has ever seen. It had 200 attendees and was a truly marvelous event. That's kind of awesome. Pretty much ensures that all of your friends will have an amazing time in your memory honor. It's like, hey, don't be sad that I'm gone. Celebrate the fact that I lived. Also, don't forget about my Jewish dog. My great uncle Joe was a son, the nicest man I've ever met. When he fell and broke his hip, my dad told him something I'd said when I found out the news. I said, wow, I can't imagine having not grown up with Uncle Joe. Everyone needs an Uncle Joe. He was so dang proud of that. Anyways, the last thing he said to my dad was to tell the rest of the family who couldn't see him in his last days what I'd said because it was the way he wanted to be remembered. I don't know why, but this one made me cry. When I was only a child, around 8 at the time, my grandmother and I had a little chat which I distinctly remember to this day. She said, when I die, I do not want to be cremated. I want to be buried with my father. As a child I smiled and nodded, not quite understanding the gravity of the request. As I later found out, she hadn't told anyone else. Wind forward about 3 months. My grandmother had passed away peacefully. My mother was on the phone to my aunt arranging funeral details. During the phone call I hear my mother explaining to my aunt that in my grandmother's will, it stated she wanted to be cremated. At this moment my 8-year-old brain remembers back to my grandmother's words and I announce it to my mother. She is surprised, sits me down and asks me to recount the story. I explain to her that Granny told me. The upshot of it all was that she was buried, as she had told me to, with her father. At the time, I had no comprehension that the events were pretty significant, but now I do, and how my grandmother trusted me with those important requests is so touching. Kudos to your mother to have the presence of mind to take a kid seriously enough to sit you down and then believe you during a time of grief. I have 2 things from my parents who have both passed away. The first one, my mother committed suicide and the only note she left was on the computer, I love you. My father told me never to eat fish in a steakhouse. Good advice. The last time I saw my grandmother she made me promise I'd wash my sheets and pillowcase once a week. Not particularly inspiring, but I do have clean sheets. I wonder what inspired your grandma to say that. It wasn't actually a request but a friend of mine who inspired me in the areas of wit, insanity, charm, and a myriad of other remarkable traits. A truly uniquely great fellow was stricken at the age of 27 with a condition no doctor could diagnose. His body gradually lost its ability to process energy on a cellular level, which caused a kind of creeping paralysis. At first everyone thought he was drunk all the time as he kind of staggered and slurred, but slowly he was reduced to permanent bed rest as he could barely move, although was still fully cognitive. I drove some hours to see him once with a small group of friends, including my then fiancée that he had not yet met, who made her living as a nude model. Needless to say she is quite attractive. We sat there for some time, talking of the good times past, telling stories and telling jokes, and we could tell from his slight movements that he was enjoying the visit. As night fell his mother, who was providing full care, suggested it was getting late and we had a drive ahead of us. So I rushed the group ahead and held back my lady, who had somehow been aware of what I was planning and was in an unspoken concurrence, as we had a way of being in each other's minds like that. I nodded to her as she proceeded to flash him the grade A goods as I lifted up his arm and facilitated much boob touching. Just after we got everything put away his mom came back, and we nodded and said goodbye. I swear I could see the thumbs up in his eyes. TLDR. Hooked up my dying friend with probably the last pair of boobies he ever laid hands on. This is the saddest boob fondling story I have ever read. The only last request I've ever gotten was from my grandmother, who told me to never stop playing the piano because I played so beautifully. I'm not that great, but I'm still playing. Grandma, I'm still playing. Your fingers must be tired. I only became close to my grandma right before she passed. In her last couple months we talked about religion, politics, art, everything. She was the only family member that really knew my religious and political views. She was very respectful of my views and I seemed to sway her opinion on most. Right before she passed, she told me, "I hope you make sense of the world. You're such a cool guy." Not much of a request, I know, but it struck me as her last thing she said to me was for me to always strive to find what I was looking for from the world. You're one cool dude. Shred on. My grandmother, who had stage 4 brain, liver, kidney, eye cancer, wrote me a letter on her deathbed, and my birthday after that I got another one from her. The fact that she spent her last hours caring about us grandkids is amazing. Mine doesn't quite compare, but I used to work with this kid that was into the same sort of books as me. We used to spend a ton of time talking about all sorts of science fiction related books, and he was very surprised I had never read the Dune novels. He kept telling me to check it out, and yet I could somehow never get around to reading any of them. Sometime later he ended up committing suicide. Took me about 2 more years to finally get over the weird shock of it, and now Dune is definitely one of my favorite books and it reminds me of him. My girlfriend's parents gained a Manhattan condo from her uncle. My girlfriend used to live in New York. We live in Las Vegas now, and she always talks about how she wants to move back. Her dad asked her and her sister one day if they would ever want to live in New York again. Her sister said no, and my girlfriend said yes. Without telling the sister, they signed the condo to her. We had no idea that it even existed until that day. I know it isn't something I received, and it may seem material, but my girlfriend has such a passion for that city. I also love it myself. Cube 95. I give you my magnum opus. Enjoy. Hot cross buns. Hot cross buns. Nana 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 hot cross buns. Frick, that was the hardest I've laughed in weeks. My brother was training for the Land's End to John O'Groats cycle ride, the 2 furthest apart points in the United Kingdom, when he was diagnosed with leukemia. He died about a year later, and a couple of days before passing away he asked me to do the ride for him. 1,200 miles. Did it about 6 months later, riding his bike. The most bittersweet moment of my life. Well, not really a last request, but I've lived with my grandparents from when I was 7 and still have a good relationship with them. My parents are divorced. Burning money. Seriously, giving them money is like throwing it in a fire. Childish and don't take responsibility in life. My aunt and uncle don't live in the neighborhood, so I'm the go-to guy for help. A couple of months ago they asked me if I would take care of their financial administration should one of them die. I said yes. Then they asked me if I would take care of selling the house when they both would be dead, and I said no. I think the heirs could take care of that themselves in a way they'd all be content with. They said that's what they thought and that I'd probably do a great job. They had written me in their will as if I was a son, equal share with my aunt and uncle, and took my mother out of it. I hope they'll use up their money living life. When my mom was dying of cancer, she told me she had a life insurance policy which would leave me a decent sum of money. I asked her what to do with it. She said, "I know your favorite thing to do is travel, so I want you to travel for as long as you can on it." After she died, I flew to Ghana. I didn't make it home for 14 months, after overlanding all the way to Europe, traveling through 10 African countries and 6 European ones, and visiting all my friends on the east coast of the US. Whoa, that's heartbreaking. This will get buried down, but here goes nothing. My stepdad died of cancer last January. He fulfilled the role of what my real father couldn't. I got really close to him during the last months of his life. From getting him up out of the bed, to the bathroom, yes, I even wiped him, and taking him to bed. During his last days, I remembered one request that will always stick to me forever. He asked if I could take my mother to the other room because he doesn't want to hear her cry. During the last days of his life, he might have been really high from medicine that he was taking, but he said the 3 words that was full of meaning. I have heard of many people saying "I love you," but he said it with so much life. TLDR. My stepdad asked me on his deathbed to take my mother to the other room so that he couldn't hear her crying. I had to take care of my mother when she was very sick, and I absolutely could not bear the thought of having to wipe her. I know people do it, but I was almost relieved when she was hospitalized before I had to manage her bodily fluids. Sorry, Mom. Better to remember you without that part. My granddad told me the night before he died to stay in education as long as I can, never get in trouble with the police, and to keep on playing the piano. I've not touched the piano for just over a year after stopping piano lessons. Thanks for making me remember this. I'm now going to go downstairs and have a play on it. Rather stay anon and allow the departed to stay anon for this post, because the requests are not nice and not cool. All 3 are from Iraq veterans, 2 American and 1 British, and their last requests haunt me because I cannot do anything about them. First asked to have his remains cremated and scattered into the Persian Gulf. His family did not agree and his body was buried as per military service funeral. Second wrote a dying confession about cheating on his wife. His CO burned the letter in front of me. The Brit asked for a shot of Guinness, which no one had, and then asked me to tell his mother he was sorry and that she was right about the war. I managed to tape record his last words, but the tape was also destroyed or lost during the body transfer, and I only managed to write some of his last words and tell them over the phone to the mother. 5 minutes of a 20-minute recording. I used to play music with my uncle every Sunday afternoon. One Sunday I played a mellow instrumental version of Dust in the Wind. He started singing to it, and after it was done he said, "You know, that was beautiful. This is going to sound strange, but do you think you can play that at my funeral someday?" I said of course and awkwardly changed the subject. I didn't think much of it until the following Saturday after he died suddenly in a motorcycle accident. It was an internal struggle whether to even mention it to anyone, but I eventually did, and unfortunately the Catholic Church running services didn't like Dust in the Wind, but I did get to play it at his wake. This isn't exactly a last request, but my grandfather was a missionary in India for several years. That's where my mother was born. After he passed away when I was about 8, each of us, my 3 siblings and I, received something in his will. I was fortunate enough to receive the badass kukri that he used while in India, complete with worn leather sheath. It's at that point I realized how cool my grandfather was. RCAF pilot in World War II, Indian missionary, and saved countless children during his 20+ years at the Children's Aid Society. Not to mention that when he heard he was going to be a grandfather, he requested that his grandfather name be El Grand, TL, DR, Swords, Grandpas. Not to be at the funeral, stepdad did a number on my mother and killed himself, and in his suicide note asked I not attend the funeral for fear I would knock over the casket. I went. I know, not that cool, but it's the only last request I've been asked. My granddad had been battling cancer for nearly a year when I started uni. I was having trouble decided between being a science teacher or going into research. I intended to be a teacher but deep down wanted to do research, and I didn't tell anyone I was debating my future career. Got a call to visit my granddad hours before he died, and when I was saying goodbye he said, "Ja Murphy, you know what you want to do." My grandpa made me swear I'd live a life he'd be proud of. Of course he didn't say it that simply, but I think about him every day and wonder what change I can make in my life every time I wake up. I know it may not seem like a very amazing last request, and of course you're all just strangers who didn't know him, but to me, those words are very special. My grandmother, we called her Goggy, got lung cancer and went downhill very fast. My last chance to visit her, I was able to spend a lot of good quality goodbye time with her. She was very close and I remember playing my first game of Go Fish with her. The last time I saw her she told me, "Thank you for understanding that death is not such a bad thing. Have a good life." I loved her very much and her last words to me will always stay with me. So far, these are my favorite last words. My father told me to take off his helmet and respirator so he could see me with his own 2 eyes. He was kind of a dong up until his life support shorted out. No one in my family who's died gave a crap about me, so I have no last request stories, but I have my own last request. I want my body made into an animatronic version of myself. I will usher my own funeral, then walk up the aisle, get into the casket and shut it after saying this exact quote: "Remember me for who I really was, a foul-mouthed inappropriate vulgar son of a bee who whipped his dong out in front of nearly all of his close friends. If there is a God after all and I was totally wrong, tell him I'm on my way to punch him in the face. He'll know why. Live a memorable life, and I love every single one of you." I work as a paramedic. I once had a call where I found my patient, an elderly obese female seated on a plastic folding chair, in decompensated congestive heart failure. When I attempted to convince her to go to the hospital, she explained, "I just need some aspirin. After you give it to me you can leave." This was her final request before she became unconscious and entered respiratory and cardiac arrest. In the end I resuscitated her on the way to the hospital and she lived for another few months. No thanks to the aspirin I didn't give her. So touching. It's not so much a really cool last request as it is a memorable one. 2.5 years ago, my uncle was dying from intestinal cancer metastasized in a fuckload of places. When I was visiting him for what I knew would be the last time he would be alive, at some point mid-conversation, he said, "Flying Dutchman 14. I know I won't be around for much longer. Since you'll be around longer than I will be and you're interested in photography and such, would you do me the favor of videotaping my funeral service in church?" Even though I probably never cried as hard as during that service, I obviously did it. One does not simply deny a dying man's last request to you. Even though it may sound mundane, my mother really cared for the flowers in her garden. On her deathbed, she asked me to plant them all over town, which I did. My mom is a caretaker and one time I went to drop off the car for her at the place she was temporarily working at. This patient was practically dead. The daughters would not let her go. She was on life support. She had rigor mortis. She just had a soft wail every once in a while. It was creepy as frick. When the daughters left the room my mom said, "I don't ever want to end up like this. If I even get close to this you better freaking step on my breathing tube, dang it." She was very serious. TLDR. My mom doesn't want to sit in a bed dying. She wants me to send her to her maker faster. I don't think you get rigor mortis before you die. My folks aren't dead yet, but my dad said if there's any religion at his funeral, he'll come back and haunt us. And mum said if we bury her with a curly fringe, bangs, then she'll leak from the coffin. Or it might have been the other way around. Either way. My favorite uncle, whom I am named after, told me 2 things on his deathbed. Go into my garage and take my John Deere tractor. She's yours. Take care of her. Also, make sure none of the kids, there are about 15 grandkids, don't drink and get into drugs. I'm counting on you. Holy crap, this was a huge responsibility, which will be nearly impossible. How could I say no? The oldest kid is still only 11, but I'm sure it's only a matter of time. I'm going to have some very busy weekend nights. BR story incoming. My dad died when I was 2 years old after a long battle with melanoma. He was a music teacher at a high school in northern Maryland and absolutely loved everything about his job and his students loved him. On his last night alive, he was still teaching. He had his most gifted piano student over and he was practicing while my dad listened. I wish my family could recall the piece he was playing, but it was so soothing that my dad just drifted off to sleep and never woke up. He died doing what he loved and I really can't ask anything more than that. I wish I had the name of the student who played for him so I could thank him for sending my dad off peacefully. Freaking onions, man. Who put these here? My aging father, 56, is nearing the end of his life, and he said to me, "I don't want my funeral to be sad. I want everyone to make something out of cardboard for me." He's a very crafty man. I even want my coffin to be made of cardboard, and when they burn me, I want a small explosion, and my mother to stand up and shout, "Now that's a fire." He also wants to be burned in his dressing gown and slippers, with a cup of tea, a cigarette and a newspaper. It's going to be the best freaking funeral ever. I'm the only one of my cousins to have met my paternal grandfather before he died from liver cancer in his early 50s, when I was 1 year old. He is the one who named me. Not really a last request or anything, but I try to live my life to the fullest as his was cut way too short. My great aunt told me to never cut my wavy hair. That was when I was like 5. Now when I let my hair grow long, it makes a fro, but I'm white, so I cut it. OP, will you share it with us when it's done? Maybe even a little video performance? If he put you on his will, I'm sure he had a high opinion on you and specially to trust his music for you to finish. I would to listen to it. Sorry to hear about your music professor when mine passed away, which I met when I was 10. When I finally got to take his classes, first thing he said to me was, "Who cares if people don't like it, be loud and proud." 2 days before my 21st birthday I sat outside his class smoking. He told me this: "Now you're gonna be 21, so I am never gonna see you again." I always said, "Be loud and proud, now just get out there and tear it up," in a badass Russian accent. My response was, "So you mean just frick crap up with no remorse?" And that was the last time we spoke. For future reference, the period is underneath the L key. My grandfather's last words to me were, "Girls. Frick lots of girls." Less than a week later, carrying on the family name was handed down to the last 2 males in the family, me and one estranged cousin. You're not supposed to do that with each other. My grandfather asked me, not in person. I sadly was not there when he died, but it came through my grandmother, so I guess I'm not completely sure if it was his request or not, to play taps for him at his funeral instead of the usual military player they have. He was in the Navy for many years, and it was a large part of his life, but one of his other passions was music, and he always supported me in it. I loved playing the trumpet, and I managed to play at the funeral and not miss a note, though I was pretty much blind because I had to close my eyes not to have the tears come out. It was pretty special. I have a picture of me playing next to his headstone, and a picture of him next to it. It's an important memory for me. My grandmother on my dad's side, the grandfather from the above story was my mom's father, made me promise to always be honest with myself, because she was just cool like that. That was the only request she made. It's hard, but I try. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.